Silence fell over the East Room. Trump looked at Security Chief Michael Reddick and simply said, "Mike," with a pointed gesture. Everyone understood what that meant. Jasmine Crockett was about to be removed. But when Reddick approached her chair, Jasmine didn't stand up. Instead, the words she spoke would be the 15 words that shattered Trump's authority forever. The morning air in Washington carried the weight of political theater as Jasmine Crockett's black sedan pulled through the White House gates at exactly 8:47 a.m. She had been invited to participate in what the administration called a bipartisan policy roundtable on urban redevelopment, though Jasmine suspected the invitation had more to do with political optics than genuine collaboration. The White House needed Democratic faces at the table to legitimize a plan that she had already identified as a thinly veiled giveaway to corporate developers at the expense of working families. As her car moved through the carefully manicured grounds, Jasmine reviewed her notes one final time. She had spent the previous evening poring over the administration's 847-page redevelopment proposal, cross-referencing budget allocations with demographic data from the neighborhoods targeted for revitalization. The numbers told a story that the glossy presentation materials carefully obscured. This wasn't community development, it was community displacement wrapped in the language of progress. The East Room entrance was bustling with the controlled chaos that preceded any high-profile White House event. Secret Service agents moved with practiced efficiency, their earpieces crackling with constant communication. White House staff members clutched tablets and clipboards, orchestrating the morning's choreography with the precision of a military operation. And threading through it all were the invited participants, mayors, housing officials, and members of Congress who had been selected as much for their willingness to play along as for their expertise. Brian Cale, a young White House liaison with perfectly combed sandy hair and the eager demeanor of someone climbing the political ladder, intercepted Jasmine at the security checkpoint. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, extending a hand with campaign photo precision. "Welcome to the White House. I'll be your point of contact this morning and help you navigate our security protocols." Jasmine accepted the handshake with professional courtesy, though she recognized Cale's role for what it was, not hospitality, but management. His job was to keep the morning running smoothly, which meant keeping potentially disruptive participants like herself contained within acceptable boundaries. "I appreciate the assistance," she replied, though both of them understood that her presence here was more about political necessity than White House preference. The security screening process was thorough but routine, the kind of elaborate theater that had become normalized in post-9/11 Washington. As Jasmine moved through metal detectors and bag checks, she observed the other participants with the strategic awareness that had served her well during her years as a trial attorney. She was looking for allies, potential obstacles, and most importantly, the power dynamics that would shape the morning's discussions. The East Room itself was a masterpiece of political stagecraft. The long mahogany table had been polished to a mirror shine, with carefully positioned nameplates and small glasses of water at each seat. The president's chair, positioned at the head of the table and elevated slightly on a riser, commanded the room's attention from every angle. 2 clusters of press chairs had been arranged at the back, with photographers and camera operators already testing their equipment for the photo opportunity that would open the meeting. Jasmine took her assigned seat halfway down the left side of the table, a position that she quickly recognized as strategically chosen. She was directly in the president's line of sight, close enough to be included in wide shots, but far enough away to be easily ignored if she proved troublesome. More importantly, her position meant that any confrontation would be captured by every camera in the room, a consideration that would prove crucial in the hours to come. As other participants filed in, the atmosphere filled with the carefully modulated conversations that characterized official Washington. A mayor from Cincinnati discussed flight delays with a housing director from Phoenix. A redevelopment advocate from Detroit made small talk about the previous week's baseball scores with a Republican congressman from Ohio. Everyone understood that the first 10 minutes would be filmed, so conversations remained safely generic, avoiding any topic that might generate an unwanted headline. Jasmine participated minimally in these pre-meeting rituals, instead using the time to observe and prepare. She had identified several potential allies among the Democratic participants, but she also recognized that party affiliation meant little in a room where career considerations often trumped policy convictions. More importantly, she was mentally rehearsing the questions she intended to ask, knowing that she would likely have only one opportunity to pierce the administration's carefully constructed narrative. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly when Michael Reddick entered the room. As the White House security chief, Reddick carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and prepared to use it. He didn't look directly at Jasmine, but she noted his presence and filed it away as a factor that might become relevant if the morning's discussions moved beyond polite disagreement. At precisely 9 a.m., the room's energy crystallized as President Trump entered, his presence immediately commanding attention from every person present. His voice was already projecting authority before he reached his chair, cutting through the morning's polite murmur with characteristic directness. "All right, let's get this going," he announced, settling into his elevated position. "We've got some big things to talk about here, huge plans. Everyone's going to benefit from this." The opening statements unfolded according to the predictable rhythm of Washington political theater. Administration officials outlined the redevelopment proposal in broad, optimistic strokes, emphasizing job creation and economic revitalization while carefully avoiding specifics about costs, timelines, or potential negative impacts. City leaders offered carefully calibrated responses that acknowledged their gratitude for federal attention while avoiding any commitments that might prove politically costly later. For the first 30 minutes, Jasmine listened and took notes, allowing the administration to present its case without interruption. She understood that patience was as important as preparation in moments like this. The scripted praise and diplomatic language that dominated the early discussion served her purposes by establishing a baseline of polite discourse that would make her eventual challenges all the more striking by contrast. But Jasmine also recognized that windows of opportunity in settings like this were limited and unpredictable. The press would be ushered out soon, reducing the visibility of any substantive exchanges. Other participants were already settling into the comfortable rhythm of managed agreement that characterized most high-level policy discussions. If she was going to force a real conversation about the proposal's implications, she needed to act while the cameras were still rolling and the administration's guard was down. The moment came sooner than she had expected, triggered by what appeared to be a routine transition between speakers. President Trump had just concluded a particularly enthusiastic description of the plan's potential economic benefits when he opened the floor for questions, clearly expecting the kind of softly supportive inquiries that typically characterize these events. Instead, Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying clearly across the room without requiring her to raise it. "Mr. President," she began, "I'd like to ask about the specific allocations within this proposal. You've mentioned a total investment of $20 billion for redeveloping targeted neighborhoods. Can you tell us right now how much of that funding is actually earmarked for affordable housing versus commercial development projects?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread instantly across the room. It was exactly the kind of specific, numbers-based inquiry that political events like this were designed to avoid. Worse, from the administration's perspective, it demanded a concrete answer that couldn't be deflected with general statements about economic growth and job creation. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and visible. Heads turned toward Jasmine, then back to the president, as participants tried to gauge how this deviation from script would be handled. Several attendees glanced toward the press pool, suddenly aware that the cameras were capturing an unscripted moment that could generate unpredictable headlines. President Trump's response revealed both his political instincts and his limitations when faced with detailed policy questions. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone carrying a note of condescension that Jasmine had expected, "it's all going to benefit the communities. When we bring in businesses, jobs follow. When jobs follow, people can afford better housing. That's how it works. It's common sense." It was a classic deflection, the kind of non-answer that had served Trump well in countless political encounters. But Jasmine had anticipated exactly this response and was ready with a follow-up that would make evasion impossible. "So that's a no on having a clear percentage," she said, her tone remaining level and factual. The words weren't accusatory, but they accomplished something more powerful than an accusation. They forced everyone in the room to confront the gap between the administration's rhetoric and its actual planning. A ripple of barely audible reaction moved across the table. Not quite laughter, not quite surprise, but the kind of human sound that people make when someone crosses a line that others have been afraid to approach. It was the sound of recognition, the acknowledgement that the morning's careful choreography had just been disrupted by someone willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Trump's smile in response was sharp rather than warm, the expression of someone who had just realized that this particular participant wasn't going to follow the expected script. "I think you're looking for a number that doesn't tell the whole story," he said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "We're talking about transformation here. We're talking about turning these neighborhoods around so people want to live there." But Jasmine was ready for this deflection too, and her response cut straight to the heart of the policy's human impact. "People already live there," she said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone stating an undeniable fact. "And many of them won't be able to afford to stay once the rent triples." The pause that followed was brief but significant. In the world of political theater, hesitation often reveals more than words, and Trump's momentary silence communicated his recognition that he was facing someone who had done her homework and wasn't intimidated by presidential authority. One of the city leaders, a tall man from Des Moines, attempted to redirect the conversation toward safer ground by mentioning infrastructure investments, but Trump waved him off with a dismissive gesture that revealed his growing irritation. This wasn't going according to the carefully planned script, and the president's frustration was becoming visible to everyone in the room. "Look," Trump said, his voice rising slightly as he leaned forward in his chair. "We're trying to help these communities. But some people would rather complain about problems than solve them. Some people are more interested in politics than progress." It was a direct attack, the kind of personal criticism that was designed to put Jasmine on the defensive and shift the conversation away from policy specifics toward partisan positioning. In most political contexts, such a challenge would either silence the target or provoke an emotional response that could be dismissed as unprofessional. But Jasmine had spent years in courtrooms where personal attacks were routine tactics used by attorneys who couldn't defend their cases on the merits. She recognized the technique and had long ago learned not to take the bait. "Mr. President," she said, her voice remaining calm and measured, "I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in numbers. If this plan displaces more families than it helps, that's not progress. That's just expensive gentrification funded by taxpayers." The word gentrification hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be deflected or dismissed. It named the policy's actual impact in terms that everyone understood, cutting through the administration's careful euphemisms to expose the human cost of urban revitalization. Trump's reaction was swift and revealed the extent to which Jasmine's persistence had gotten under his skin. He turned to look directly at Michael Reddick, the security chief who had been standing motionless against the wall, and spoke a single word that would define everything that followed. "Mike." It wasn't shouted or emphasized, just a simple name accompanied by a slight gesture that every person in the room immediately understood. The president was ordering security to remove a sitting member of Congress from an official White House meeting, an action that was unprecedented in its audacity and potentially catastrophic in its implications. The room went completely silent. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next speaker, but the stunned silence of people witnessing something that crossed fundamental boundaries of democratic governance. Every conversation stopped, every pen ceased moving, every person present turned to watch what would happen next. Michael Reddick moved with professional precision, his footsteps the only sound in the suddenly still room. He approached Jasmine's chair with the careful bearing of someone executing an order he understood but might not personally endorse. When he reached her position, His voice was low and professional, designed to minimize the scene while making the president's intent unmistakably clear. "Congresswoman," he said quietly, "I'll need you to come with me." Every microphone in the room picked up his words, and every camera captured the moment when presidential authority confronted congressional independence. The press pool, which had been preparing to be ushered out, suddenly found themselves documenting what might be the most significant constitutional moment of the Trump presidency. But Jasmine didn't move. She remained seated, her hands folded on the table, her breathing controlled and deliberate. She had spent her entire political career preparing for moments when standing up required sitting still, when courage meant refusing to be moved rather than making dramatic gestures. "I understand you're doing what you've been told," she said to Reddick, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "but I'm not leaving without saying something." It was a line drawn in the sand, a moment when individual conscience confronted institutional authority. Everyone present understood that what happened next would determine whether democratic norms could withstand direct presidential challenge or whether the office's power extended to silencing elected representatives who asked inconvenient questions. Jasmine turned her attention back to President Trump, who was watching the confrontation with the intensity of someone who understood that his authority was being tested in the most public way possible. When she spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, chosen for their precision rather than their volume. "Mr. President," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it, "you can remove me from the room, but you can't remove the truth from the record." The 15 words hit the room like a physical force. They weren't shouted or dramatized, but they carried the weight of fundamental principle expressed at a moment of maximum consequence. The sentence seemed to reverberate off the walls before reaching anyone's ears, creating a moment of suspension where everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The immediate impact was visible in Trump's expression, which shifted from confident authority to something approaching uncertainty. For perhaps the first time in his presidency, he found himself facing someone who couldn't be intimidated, dismissed, or silenced through the usual applications of power. But the reaction that truly changed the room's dynamics came from an unexpected source. From halfway down the table, a housing commissioner from Florida leaned slightly toward his microphone and said, just loudly enough to be heard, "She's got a point." The words were barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the room, they carried with the force of a public declaration. Within seconds, another voice joined in, a Republican redevelopment advisor from Indiana who muttered, "The record's the record. Can't argue with that." The cameras swiveled to capture these unexpected moments of support, and suddenly the confrontation wasn't just between Jasmine and the president. It had become a test of whether other officials would stand with truth-telling or institutional authority when forced to choose between them. Trump's eyes moved across the faces of the people who had just, however subtly, undermined his command. For the first time since issuing the order, he looked away from Jasmine, scanning the room for allies who might restore his dominance of the moment. But the expressions he saw weren't reassuring. Too many participants were looking down at their notes or avoiding eye contact entirely. Michael Reddick, still standing beside Jasmine's chair, found himself in an impossible position. He had been given a direct presidential order, but executing it now would confirm everything that Jasmine had just said about the administration's fear of accountability. His stance shifted slightly, his forward momentum stopping as he waited for clarification from a president who suddenly seemed less certain of his next move. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected, filled with the weight of implications that extended far beyond a single meeting or policy proposal. This was a moment when American democracy's fundamental assumptions about the balance of power were being tested in real time, broadcast live to a nation that was watching its institutions navigate uncharted territory. Finally, Trump raised his hand again, but this time the gesture was different. Instead of the pointed authority that had summoned Reddick, it was a dismissive wave that suggested frustration rather than control. "Let's move on," he said, turning his attention to the stack of papers in front of him with the kind of deliberate focus that was clearly intended to signal that the confrontation was over. Reddick stepped back without a word, returning to his position against the wall. The cameras caught this retreat as well, documenting the moment when a presidential order quietly dissolved in the face of principled resistance and unexpected support from within the room. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Having established her right to remain, she used the moment to do exactly what she had come to do, force a substantive discussion of the policy's real-world implications. She opened her folder, removed a detailed chart showing displacement projections for the targeted neighborhoods, and slid it across the table toward the president. "Since we're continuing," she said, as if the dramatic confrontation had been nothing more than a brief interruption, "I'd like to share some data about what this redevelopment plan will actually mean for current residents." The chart was devastating in its clarity, showing projected rent increases, demographic shifts, and displacement patterns that contradicted every optimistic claim the administration had made about community benefits. More importantly, it was based on the administration's own data, making it impossible to dismiss as partisan speculation. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with a completely different dynamic. Other participants, emboldened by Jasmine's example and perhaps shamed by their own previous silence, began asking more pointed questions about implementation, oversight, and accountability measures. The administration's officials, clearly rattled by the morning's unexpected turn, provided less confident answers and made more specific commitments than they had originally intended. When the meeting finally concluded, the atmosphere was subdued rather than celebratory. Chairs scraped back from the table with less ceremony than usual, and small clusters of participants formed near the doors with hushed conversations about what they had just witnessed. Some looked shaken, others energized, but everyone understood that they had been present for a moment that would be analyzed and debated long after the day's news cycle had moved on. As Jasmine gathered her materials and prepared to leave, she was approached by several participants who wanted to express support or simply process what had happened. The mayor from St. Paul, who had whispered encouragement during the confrontation, pulled her aside with information that surprised her. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "But after you spoke up, 2 of the Republican officials in that room started texting their chiefs about the housing numbers you mentioned. You got under their skin in a good way." It was confirmation that her strategy had worked not just as political theater, but as substantive policy advocacy. By forcing specific questions about budget allocations and displacement impacts, she had planted seeds of doubt that would continue growing long after the cameras stopped rolling. The immediate aftermath, however, was just beginning. As Jasmine made her way through the White House corridors toward the exit, she encountered Terrell Vaughn, a policy analyst she knew from previous committee hearings. His reaction was immediate and unfiltered. "I wasn't expecting to see you here today," he said, keeping his voice low, despite the relative privacy of the hallway. "And I definitely wasn't expecting to see you do what half the people in that room wish they had the guts to do." Before Jasmine could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the mayor from St. Paul, who had followed them into the corridor with additional information that he clearly felt compelled to share. "I wanted you to know," he said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone delivering important intelligence, "that after you refused to leave, I watched several people in that room completely change their posture. They weren't just impressed, they were inspired. You gave them permission to ask the questions they'd been afraid to ask." By the time Jasmine reached the White House exit, she was intercepted by a press photographer who had managed to position himself strategically for one final shot. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said quietly, "that line about removing truth from the record, it's already bouncing around online. Somebody streamed the feed before we got cut off." The comment confirmed what Jasmine had suspected, that the confrontation's impact would extend far beyond the room where it occurred. In the age of social media and instant communication, moments of authentic political courage had the potential to reach millions of people within hours, creating ripple effects that could reshape public discourse and political expectations. As her sedan pulled away from the White House, Jasmine's phone began vibrating with a steady stream of messages. Text previews flashed across her screen. Saw what happened? That was unreal. They're playing it on MSNBC right now. You just made history. But Jasmine resisted the temptation to dive immediately into the reactions and analysis. She needed time to process what had happened and to prepare for the intense scrutiny that she knew would follow. More importantly, she wanted to ensure that the conversation remained focused on the policy issues that had motivated her challenge, rather than the political theater that had made it dramatic. The ride back to Capitol Hill gave her the space she needed to reflect on the morning's events and their broader significance. She had entered the White House knowing that she might face resistance to her questions, but she hadn't anticipated the extent to which Trump would be willing to use presidential authority to silence congressional oversight. The fact that he had been forced to back down suggested that there were still limits to executive power, but only when individuals were willing to test those limits publicly and at personal risk. By the afternoon, the confrontation was already being analyzed and debated across every major news platform. Cable networks interrupted regular programming to replay the key moments. Political commentators offered competing interpretations of its significance, and social media platforms buzzed with reaction from viewers who had witnessed the exchange in real time. The response revealed deep divisions in how Americans viewed both the confrontation and its broader implications. Supporters praised Jasmine's courage and saw her refusal to be silenced as a defense of democratic principles. Critics accused her of grandstanding and using a policy meeting for political theater. But even those who disagreed with her approach struggled to explain why asking specific questions about budget allocations should result in removal from an official government meeting. More significantly, the incident had exposed the administration's sensitivity to detailed scrutiny of its policy proposals. By attempting to silence rather than answer Jasmine's questions, Trump had inadvertently confirmed that the redevelopment plan couldn't withstand the kind of examination that responsible governance required. In the days that followed, Jasmine used the momentum generated by the confrontation to advance substantive policy alternatives. Working with housing advocates and policy experts, her office released a comprehensive analysis of the administration's proposal that detailed its likely impacts on displacement, affordability, and community stability. The document, which might have received limited attention under normal circumstances, was downloaded and shared widely by people who had been energized by her White House performance. The long-term impact of the confrontation extended beyond immediate policy debates to broader questions about the relationship between executive authority and congressional oversight. Legal scholars debated whether Trump's attempt to remove a member of Congress from an official meeting constituted an abuse of power. Constitutional experts discussed the precedent that would have been set if Jasmine had been successfully silenced. Political scientists analyzed the incident as a case study in how individual courage could challenge institutional authority, even in settings designed to minimize dissent. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the message that Jasmine's stand had sent to other elected officials and citizens who had felt powerless in the face of expanding executive authority. Her refusal to be intimidated demonstrated that democratic norms could still be defended by individuals willing to risk their comfort and safety for principles larger than themselves. 6 months later, when Jasmine was invited to deliver a keynote address at the National Conference of Democratic Officials, she used the opportunity to reflect on the lessons of that White House confrontation and their relevance to the broader challenges facing American democracy. Democracy isn't a spectator sport, she told the audience of elected officials and activists. It requires active participation, constant vigilance, and occasional acts of courage that feel uncomfortable in the moment but prove essential for the long-term health of our institutions. She paused, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity of American political leadership, before delivering the line that would define her legacy as much as her White House confrontation had. "The truth doesn't need permission to exist," she said. "It only needs people brave enough to speak it when it matters most. And in a democracy under threat, it always matters most." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, But Jasmine was already thinking about the next policy fight, the next opportunity to prove that individual conscience could still make a difference in a system designed to reward conformity and punish dissent. The East Room confrontation had been just one moment in a longer struggle for accountability and transparency, but it had demonstrated that such moments were still possible when people were willing to risk everything for principles that transcended personal comfort or political calculation. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine's White House confrontation created a political earthquake that reverberated through Washington's corridors of power for weeks. Within hours of the meeting's conclusion, the video clips had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms. But the real impact was being felt in the private conversations and strategic calculations of political operatives who understood that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. In the West Wing, senior staff members found themselves in crisis management mode as they tried to craft a response that could minimize the damage from Trump's failed attempt to silence a member of Congress. Hope Hicks, the White House communications director, convened an emergency meeting with Press Secretary Sarah Sanders and Chief of Staff John Kelly to develop talking points that could somehow frame the incident as a victory rather than a humiliating retreat. The president showed remarkable restraint, Sanders eventually told reporters during her daily briefing, by allowing the Congresswoman to continue participating despite her disruptive behavior. But the explanation fell flat when reporters pressed for details about why removal had been ordered in the first place and why it had been rescinded so quickly. The administration's difficulties in explaining the incident only amplified its significance. Political commentators noted that Trump, who had built his brand on projecting strength and dominance, had been forced to back down in the most public way possible. The contrast between his confident order to security and his eventual retreat created a narrative of weakness that his opponents would exploit for months. But the impact extended far beyond partisan political calculations. Congressional Democrats, who had often struggled to find effective ways to challenge Trump's authority, suddenly had a new model for resistance. Within days of Jasmine's performance, other Democratic members began adopting more confrontational approaches in their own interactions with the administration. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had already established herself as a fierce critic of Trump's policies, publicly praised Jasmine's courage and incorporated similar tactics into her questioning during subsequent congressional hearings. "What Jasmine showed us," Ocasio-Cortez said during a televised interview, "is that we don't have to accept deflection and evasion as normal parts of political discourse. We can demand real answers, and we can refuse to be silenced when we don't get them." The transformation wasn't limited to progressive Democrats. Moderate members who had previously avoided direct confrontation with the administration began asking more pointed questions and pushing back more aggressively when officials attempted to evade accountability. The Jasmine Standard, as some political observers dubbed it, created new expectations for how elected officials should respond when faced with executive branch stonewalling. Republican reactions were more complex and revealed significant divisions within the party. While Trump loyalists criticized Jasmine's behavior as disrespectful and partisan, other Republicans privately expressed admiration for her willingness to ask tough questions about policy details. Several GOP members who had attended the meeting reached out to their Democratic colleagues to express support for more substantive policy discussions, even if they disagreed with Jasmine's conclusions. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, known for her moderate positions and willingness to work across party lines, made headlines when she told reporters that asking specific questions about budget allocations isn't disruptive. It's responsible governance. We need more of that kind of detailed oversight, not less. The comment created a minor firestorm within Republican circles, but it also provided cover for other moderate GOP members who had grown uncomfortable with their party's reflexive defense of Trump's more controversial actions. The White House incident had created space for Republicans to distance themselves from the administration without appearing to betray core conservative principles. The policy implications of Jasmine's challenge proved even more significant than the political theater surrounding it. The specific questions she had raised about affordable housing allocations within the redevelopment proposal sparked detailed analysis by policy experts and advocacy organizations. When the numbers were examined closely, they revealed that her concerns had been entirely justified. The Urban Institute, a nonpartisan research organization, published a comprehensive analysis of the administration's proposal that confirmed Jasmine's assertions about displacement and affordability. The study found that the plan would likely result in the displacement of approximately 47,000 low-income families while creating only 12,000 units of affordable housing, a net loss that contradicted every public claim the administration had made about community benefits. The release of this analysis created additional political problems for the White House, which found itself defending a policy that appeared designed to enrich developers at the expense of vulnerable communities. Under pressure from both Democratic critics and moderate Republicans, the administration was forced to substantially revise the proposal, adding stronger protections for existing residents and increasing funding for affordable housing construction. Housing advocates across the country recognized that these concessions represented a direct result of Jasmine's willingness to challenge the administration publicly. Maria Rodriguez, director of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, credited Jasmine with forcing a conversation that powerful interests desperately wanted to avoid. Her courage in that White House meeting saved thousands of families from displacement. The incident also had profound implications for how media covered interactions between Congress and the executive branch. Political journalists, who had often focused on the theatrical aspects of such confrontations, began paying closer attention to the substantive policy questions that motivated them. News organizations started assigning reporters with specialized expertise to cover housing, healthcare, and other complex policy areas, recognizing that dramatic moments like Jasmine's White House stand often revealed important stories about governance and accountability. The Columbia Journalism Review published an analysis of media coverage following the incident, noting that Congresswoman Crockett's refusal to accept evasion as an answer reminded journalists that our job isn't just to report what officials say, but to examine whether their statements align with documented facts. Her example elevated the quality of political reporting across multiple news organizations. Perhaps most significantly, the confrontation inspired a new generation of political activists and potential candidates who saw in Jasmine's example a model for effective resistance to institutional power. Democratic campaign organizations reported significant increases in candidate recruitment in the months following the White House incident, with many prospective candidates specifically citing Jasmine's courage as motivation for seeking office. Emily Chen, a 34-year-old public defender from Oregon who decided to run for Congress after watching the confrontation, explained her decision in terms that reflected broader changes in political culture. I realized that we can't just complain about politicians who don't fight for us. We have to become politicians who will fight. Jasmine showed us what that looks like. The incident also had international implications, as democracy advocates around the world studied Jasmine's tactics and adapted them for their own struggles against authoritarian overreach. Parliamentary opposition leaders in countries as diverse as Poland, Brazil, and the Philippines incorporated elements of her approach into their own confrontations with executive power. A particularly notable example occurred in the Canadian Parliament, where opposition leader Jagmeet Singh refused to yield the floor during question period when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau attempted to end debate on Indigenous rights legislation. Singh explicitly referenced Jasmine's White House confrontation, telling reporters afterward that, "Sometimes democracy requires us to be uncomfortable in defense of principle. We cannot allow powerful people to silence inconvenient questions." The academic community also took notice of the confrontation's broader implications for democratic governance. Political science professors began incorporating the incident into their courses as a case study in how individual courage could challenge institutional power. The Harvard Kennedy School developed an entire seminar around the concept of principled resistance, using Jasmine's example to explore how elected officials could balance institutional loyalty with democratic accountability. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a political scientist at Georgetown University who specialized in executive legislative relations, published a widely cited paper arguing that the Crockett incident represents a watershed moment in how we understand the balance between respect for office and the obligation to hold power accountable. Her refusal to be silenced established new norms for congressional oversight that will influence political behavior for generations. In reflecting on the incident's anniversary, she returned to the theme that had motivated her original challenge. Democracy isn't a system that runs on autopilot. It requires constant maintenance, regular challenges to power, and occasional moments of courage that feel uncomfortable but prove necessary. That White House meeting reminded all of us that we have both the opportunity and the obligation to demand better from our government. The confrontation had become more than a political moment. It had evolved into a reminder of what democratic accountability could look like when practiced with courage, preparation, and unwavering commitment to the public good. If this story of standing up to power inspired you to think differently about courage in public service, we want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the moments when individual conscience changes the course of history. What would you have done in Jasmine's situation? Would you have stayed in your seat when the president ordered your removal? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who believes that democracy requires citizens brave enough to speak truth to power, even when the stakes couldn't be higher. We'll see you in the next video, where we explore how this White House confrontation inspired other elected officials to find their own courage in the face of institutional pressure.